My name is Victoria Russell, and I'm an assistant professor of Spanish and foreign language education in the Department of Modern and Classical Languages at Valdosta State University. In this presentation, I'm going to give an overview of my article that appears in the Spring 2014 edition of Foreign Language Annals. The title of the article is A Closer Look at the Output Hypothesis, the Effect of Pushed Output on Noticing and Inductive Learning of the Spanish Future Tense. According to Swain's output hypothesis, when learners attempt to speak or write in a second language, they may not know or remember the grammatical forms or vocabulary items that they need to communicate. Swain calls this noticing a hole or a gap in the learner's interlanguage knowledge. Therefore, when second language learners attempt to produce output, they're forced into noticing what they do not know or what they know only partially. Swain claims that output has a noticing function because learners are prompted to search out the relevant forms or structures that they're lacking in their subsequent target language input. The present study is a conceptual replication of Izumi's 2002 study. He attempted to test the noticing function of Swain's output hypothesis. He did this by comparing pushed output, which is an internal priming device for noticing, to exposure to textual input enhancement, which is an external priming device for noticing. Izumi also combined output with textual enhancement to determine if there were additive effects when learners were exposed to both techniques. Izumi found that the textual enhancement groups demonstrated more noticing of targeted forms than the output groups. However, the increased noticing did not lead to increased learning, as the output groups outperformed the textual enhancement groups on the learning measures. Izumi examined the acquisition of relative clauses among advanced English language learners, which is a late acquired feature across languages. It is also very difficult for second language learners to notice this form because it is functionally expendable. In other words, relative clauses can be omitted from an input text and the meaning of the text would not change. Textual enhancement is any type of formatting technique that makes certain features of the written input stand out for the reader. Some examples of textual enhancement include bolding or highlighting a text, enlarging a text, or using different colors to make the text prominent. In the example on this slide, color is used to make the past tense morpheme in English visually salient. There has been very little research on the noticing function of the output hypothesis. Thus far, Izumi's 2002 study is the only published study found to support the noticing function of output, and his results were only partially able to do so. Similarly, there have been relatively few studies that have examined textual enhancement, and those results have also been mixed and inconclusive. This study had two research questions. The first research question was, what effect does the production of output, the presence of textually enhanced input, or a combination of the two have on the noticing and acquisition of the third-person singular form of the Spanish future tense? The second research question was, what effect does the production of output, the presence of textually enhanced input, or a combination of the two have on learners' input processing of the third-person singular form of the Spanish future tense? The first research question addressed the noticing and acquisition of the targeted form that was brought about by exposure to the experimental treatments. This research question replicated Izumi's 2002 study. The second research question attempted to uncover whether exposure to the instructional treatments had an effect on learners' input processing. Input processing refers to the initial process by which a learner connects a grammatical form with a referential meaning. It's important to note that second language learners may process their input either correctly or incorrectly initially. Unlike Izumi's study, which investigated a complex and late acquired grammatical form, the present study examined the third-person future tense morpheme in Spanish, which is a relatively simple form. It is an accented A added to the entire infinitive of the verb. In addition, this grammatical form has a transparent form-function relationship. This means that the inflectional morpheme by itself conveys semantic or future tense meaning. The participants in this study were 55 beginning level students of Spanish who only had 8 weeks of instruction prior to the study. All of the participants' first language was English. 2 short input texts were created for this study. Each text consisted of 11 sentences, with 7 sentences containing the targeted form. Subject pronouns, which are normally dropped in Spanish, were included because the students had not yet fully mastered subject pronoun usage in Spanish. In addition, only familiar vocabulary items were used in both input passages. The enhancements in the present study included bolding the text, enlarging it, and using a different font style. The entire future tense form was bolded in hopes that learners would notice that the morpheme is added to the entire infinitive rather than just adding it to the stem of the verb, which is the norm in Spanish. 2 tests were developed for this study, a grammaticality judgment test and a closed test. Both tests were combined and delivered as a pre-test and a post-test. However, the pre-test was only used as a screening device to ensure that no participant had any prior knowledge of the future tense system in Spanish. There were 4 experimental groups: output with textual enhancement, output without textual enhancement, no output with textual enhancement, and no output and no textual enhancement. There was also a control group that received no instruction. The control group was included to determine if the visual salience of the targeted form had an effect by itself. The instructional techniques examined in this study were both inductive and implicit. They were inductive, meaning that there was no explicit explanation of grammar, and they were implicit, meaning that the students were not guided by the instructor or the materials on what they should notice. The students were expected to notice and learn the underlying future tense pattern on their own, either by exposure to textual input enhancement, pushed output, or a combination of both techniques. The treatment procedures in this study paralleled Izumi's. The experimental treatments took place on 2 separate days over the course of 1 week. The output groups were instructed to read the text and to underline any word or words that they felt would be necessary to accurately reconstruct the input passage from memory. The non-output groups were instructed to read the text and to underline any word or words that they felt would be necessary to understand the text. After reading and underlining, the output groups were asked to reconstruct the text word for word, and the non-output groups were required to answer multiple choice extension questions. After either reconstructing the text or answering multiple choice questions about the text, all of the experimental groups were provided with a clean copy of the same input passage and asked to repeat the entire process again. The texts were enhanced on the second input exposure for the textual enhancement groups. In the final phase of the treatments, participants were asked to write a recall summary of the passage in English. These summaries were used in an attempt to measure learners' input processing of the future tense forms. The number of future tense verb forms written down in English determined whether learners had full, partial, or no comprehension of the time reference of the input passage. By asking participants to perform the same series of tasks twice, it was possible to measure the increase in noticing from the first input exposure to the second input exposure. Similarly, it was also possible to measure the increase in accuracy from the first reconstruction task to the second one. The procedures used in this study enabled the noticing function of the output hypothesis to be tested empirically. During the first reconstruction task, students in the output groups should have noticed a hole or a gap in their knowledge of the future tense system in Spanish. Theoretically, They should have paid more careful attention to the novel future tense forms during the second input exposure. Thus, any increase in noticing during the input exposures or any increase in accuracy during the text reconstruction tasks would lend weight to or support the noticing function of Swain's output hypothesis. The two output groups in the present study outperformed the two non-output groups and the control group at post-test as measured by grammaticality judgment and closed test scores. Exposure to textual enhancement did not bring about similar learning gains. These findings are consistent with Izumi's results. The analysis of underlying scores revealed a three-way interaction during treatment 1, and the results indicated that pushed output appeared to facilitate greater noticing of targeted forms over time when it was not combined with textual enhancement. Both output groups also demonstrated significant increases in reconstruction scores over time during treatments 1 and 2. This finding supports the noticing function of the output hypothesis. It is noteworthy that there was no effect for textual enhancement on the text reconstruction tasks. The two output groups outperformed the textual enhancement groups on the written recall summary in English. Comprehension scores were used in an attempt to measure input processing of the targeted form. However, given that lexical cues for the future were also included in the input passages, it is presently unclear whether learners processed future tense morphology, lexical cues for the future, or both. Thus, more research is needed before any definitive claims can be made with respect to input processing. Based on the findings of this study and those of Izumi 2002, instructors should not attempt to teach second language grammar inductively through exposure to input passages that contain textual enhancement of targeted forms, as this technique appears to be ineffective, whether the grammatical form is complex or simple. On the other hand, pushed output appeared to facilitate inductive and implicit learning, as students were able to learn the rule for forming the future tense on their own without any explicit grammar instruction or directions on what to pay attention to in the input materials. In 2011, Jean and Simard conducted a large-scale study on teacher and learner perceptions of the instruction of grammar. They found that both students and instructors alike perceived grammar instruction as being necessary but boring. Because students' negative feelings about grammar instruction could dampen their motivation for language learning, Jean and Simard suggested that grammar should be taught explicitly only when it is absolutely necessary. The results of this study indicate that the Spanish future tense does not require explicit instruction, as completing pushed output activities followed by exposure to the targeted forms in subsequent input, enabled the students to learn the future tense pattern inductively. When planning to use output-input activities to promote inductive grammar learning, it is advisable to use or create input passages that have sufficient examples of the targeted form. It is also important to include only familiar vocabulary items in the input passages. In addition, only one form or structure should be incorporated at a time, rather than the full paradigm of verb forms. Finally, 2 different input texts should be used, and students should have at least 2 opportunities to read and reconstruct each text. Thank you for your interest in this research study and for watching my video abstract. For more information on this article, please consult the Spring 2014 edition of Foreign Language Annals.